The legal documents sat on my mahogany desk. Their edges yellowed with age, but their implications crystal clear. For 30 years, I had lived a modest life as a high school history teacher, unaware that my grandfather's eccentric habit of buying worthless swamp and scrub land had culminated in a geographic stranglehold. When the executor of his estate handed me the deeds, he didn't just give me land. He gave me a tactical map. I had inherited 2,300 acres of prime coastal shelf in North Carolina. But the kicker, the part that made the executor chuckle nervously, was the layout. The prestigious Azure Shores gated community, a bastion of high fences and higher egos, sat entirely on a massive parcel my grandfather had leased to a developer back in the 70s on a 99-year land lease. More importantly, the only paved artery connecting the community to the state highway, a 2-mile stretch known as Heron's Neck Road, was owned by me in fee simple. I wasn't a spiteful person by nature, but I knew Azure Shores. 5 years ago, my mother had lived there in a small cottage on the edge of the development. The Homeowners Association, HOA, had made her final years a misery. They fined her for the unauthorized color of her bird feeder. They threatened a lien on her house because her gravel driveway had too many gray stones and not enough white ones. When she passed, the HOA president, a man named Sterling Vance, had the audacity to send a floral arrangement with a bill for the emergency landscaping, required to remove her rose bushes, which were apparently 3 inches too tall. Now I held the keys to their kingdom. I decided to visit the Azure Shores clubhouse for their monthly board meeting. I didn't go as the landlord, I went as a guest. The room smelled of expensive leather and unearned superiority. Sterling Vance sat at the head of a long oak table, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. "This meeting is for residents only," Vance barked as I walked in. "If you're looking for the maintenance entrance, it's around the back." "I'm not maintenance, Sterling," I said, pulling up a chair. "I'm Elias Thorne. My mother was Martha Thorne. You might remember the rosebush incident." Vance rolled his eyes. "Ah, yes, the woman who couldn't follow basic aesthetics. What do you want, Thorne? If you're here to contest the final cleaning fees on her estate, you're years too late." "Actually," I said, leaning back, "I'm here to discuss the lease. And the road." I laid the survey maps on the table. The board members leaned in, their faces shifting from annoyance to confusion, then to a pale, sickly shade of gray. "My grandfather leased this land to the original developer," I explained calmly. "The lease has a good neighbor clause. It states that the lease remains valid as long as the occupying entity does not infringe upon the quiet enjoyment or personal property rights of the surrounding landowners. By harassing my mother and dozens of other seniors in this community, you've breached the spirit of that lease. But more importantly," I pointed to the thin strip of asphalt labeled Heron's Neck Road. "I own the road, all of it, from the highway to the gatehouse." "That's ridiculous," Vance scoffed, though his hand trembled as he reached for his water. "It's a public access way. Check the county records, Sterling. It's a private easement that expired 6 months ago. You've been trespassing for a while now, and frankly, I've decided I don't like the traffic." The next morning, I hired a construction crew. We didn't block the road with a gate. That would be too easy to bypass legally. Instead, I exercised my right to agricultural maintenance. We tore up a 50-foot section of the asphalt right at the entrance of the highway and replaced it with a deep, muddy trench. Then I parked a fleet of rusted tractors and old shipping containers along the shoulders of the road. By noon, the line of Mercedes and BMWs stretched back a mile. People were honking. Sterling Vance arrived in his Range Rover screaming at the workers. "You can't do this!" he yelled, standing on the edge of the trench. "People have jobs. We have deliveries. I'm just prepping the land for my new venture," I said, leaning against a shipping container. "I'm thinking of starting a pig farm right here at the entrance. The smell of manure is wonderful for the soul, don't you think? It's very rustic." "You're insane!" Vance shrieked. "We'll sue you into the Stone Age." "With what standing?" I asked. "You're sitting on my land, driving on my road, and you haven't paid the adjusted property tax pass-through in 3 decades. My lawyers are already filing the eviction notice for the entire HOA. The Great Siege, as the local papers called it, lasted a week. The residents of Azure Shores were forced to park their luxury cars at a nearby shopping mall and hike through a wooded trail. I had graciously cleared for them. The sight of corporate lawyers and retired hedge fund managers trudging through the North Carolina humidity with bags of groceries was a sight to behold. The emotional depth of the conflict began to surface when the normal residents, the ones who had been bullied by Vance for years, started reaching out. I received a knock on the door of my small farmhouse one evening. It was Mrs. Gable, a widow who lived 3 doors down from where my mother had stayed. "Elias," she said softly, "I know why you're doing this, and Lord knows Vance deserves it. But some of us can't walk that trail. Mr. Henderson needs his oxygen tanks delivered. The pharmacy can't get the van through." That was the moment the anger cooled. I realized I was becoming the very thing I hated. A person who used power to make life difficult for the vulnerable. My quarrel wasn't with the 400 families in Azure Shores. It was with the system of control that Vance had built. I invited Mrs. Gable in for tea. "What if I told you there was a way to fix this permanently?" I asked. "A way where Vance loses his power and you all get your road back?" "We'd do anything," she said. The next day I didn't call Sterling Vance. I called a developer. I knew a man named Marcus Thorne, no relation, who specialized in conservation communities. Marcus was known for building neighborhoods that blended into the environment rather than paving over it. We spent 48 hours hammering out a deal that was as complex as it was beautiful. I met the HOA board one last time. This time the room was packed with residents. The atmosphere was electric with resentment, not just toward me, but toward Vance, whose tough guy routine had resulted in them carrying toilet paper through the woods for 7 days. "I have an offer," I told the crowd. Vance stood up. "We don't want your offers. We want our road." "Shut up, Sterling," a voice yelled from the back. It was Mr. Henderson leaning on his cane. "Let the man speak." I stood up and addressed the room. "I am selling the 2,300 acres, all of it, including the land under your houses and the road that leads to them." A gasp moved through the room. If a hostile developer bought the land, they could raise the ground leases to astronomical levels. "However," I continued, "I am selling it to a new entity, the Azure Green Trust. Every resident here will be a shareholder in that trust. The land lease is officially dissolved. You will own the land your houses sit on. The road will become a public dedicated way, maintained by the county." The room was silent. This was the dream. Total ownership. No more ground lease anxiety. "But," I added, my voice hardening, "there are conditions. To fund the purchase of the land from me, the trust will take over the HOA's assets. The first act of the trust will be the immediate dissolution of the current HOA board. A new charter will be written, one that forbids fines for bird feeders, rose bushes, or paint colors. And finally, Sterling Vance is barred from ever holding a position of authority in this community again." The roar of approval was so loud it rattled the windows. Vance turned a shade of purple. "I didn't know existed. The closing took place a month later. I sold the 2,300 acres for a significant sum, less than it was worth on the open market, but more than I would ever need in 3 lifetimes. As the final signatures were blotted, I felt a weight lift. I walked out to Heron's Neck Road. The trench had been filled and repaved. The shipping containers were gone. I stood at the spot where the HOA's Rules and Regulations sign used to stand. In its place was a simple wooden plaque the residents had commissioned. It read Martha's Way, dedicated to the freedom of the garden.